Okay, welcome back. In this lecture, we will locate and identify the arteries that deliver oxygenated blood to the brain. Did you know that your brain's blood supply is redundant in order to minimize your chances of having a major circulatory crisis there? We will discuss that redundancy in this lecture. And finally, we will identify the structures of the circle of Willis. So let's get started. Question. Once the good blood gets up into the cranium via the internal carotid artery, remember, how does it get into the brain? In other words, which vessels actually deliver oxygenated blood to your brain? Now, your brain is extremely sensitive to any change, however slight, in its blood supply. And if blood flow to the brain is interrupted for even a few seconds, then you can pass out. After about 4 minutes of interrupted blood flow, some degree of permanent brain damage is very likely. Now, fortunately, such circulatory crises are rare as your brain has a redundant system for obtaining its much-needed supply of oxygenated blood. That is to say that your brain receives its supply of good blood via both the internal carotid arteries as well as the vertebral arteries. I told you we'd be seeing them again. And so how are these two systems integrated? So if we extract your brain and examine its inferior aspect, well, it looks pretty complicated. But I don't want you to freak out here. I want you to focus your attention on this area right here. Okay, so I'm going to enlarge it for you so that we can examine it closer. So we can begin right here with the vertebral arteries. Remember them? Here they are, sending along either side of the spinal cord. They enter the cranium with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. Now, once inside the cranium, the two vertebral arteries join together at the base of the brain to form the basilar artery right here. The basilar artery then divides as the left and right posterior cerebral arteries. You know now that the arterial blood flow to your brain is redundant and that as well as receiving blood through the vertebral arteries, your brain receives blood by way of the internal carotid arteries. And here you see the internal carotid artery. Remember that the internal carotid has 3 branches. So here you can see the ophthalmic division. And here is the anterior cerebral division. And here is the middle cerebral division. Now, the posterior communicating artery, right here, joins the posterior cerebral artery to the anterior cerebral artery. And the anterior communicating artery, right here, is a short little artery that connects the left and right anterior cerebral arteries. So the area here that I've outlined in yellow for you is formed by the posterior cerebrals, the posterior communicating arteries, the anterior cerebrals, and the little anterior communicating artery. Now this area represents an anastomosis. That's just a series of interconnected vessels and is formally called the cerebral arterial circle. I know that I've drawn a trapezoid here, it's okay, and it's otherwise known as the circle of Willis, named after English-born royal physician and anatomist Thomas Willis. So we can finish this illustration up by identifying the superior cerebellar artery here and the inferior cerebellar artery right here. We'll discuss the cerebellum in the next section. And these little branches here are called the pontine arteries. Now the pons is another neural structure which we'll examine later. Now as I sat back staring at this illustration, I started thinking to myself, that kind of looks like a little figure, like a little alien figure. Well, that's just the way my mind works. So I decided to create a little alien creature as a way to help you remember the arteries. So my little alien creature has a large round head. It has 2 very large eyes. His very strange mouth parts are down here. Now I gave him some eyebrows just to make him a little more human. But he is an alien, so he must have a couple of antennae. He has kind of a long, slender body, but I did give him some ribs just to bulk him up a bit. Now he has 4 arms, 2 up here and 2 down here. And finally he has 2 legs. Now tell me, doesn't that look just like the illustration on the left? And by the way, I named my little alien creature Willis because, well, for obvious reasons. Now, Willis embodies everything you see in the illustration of the arterial circulation of the brain. That's a true story. Watch. His legs represent the vertebral arteries. His little torso is the basilar artery. Now remember that the basilar artery gives rise to the posterior cerebrals, and those are his mouth parts. His eyes represent the internal carotid arteries. Now recall that the internal carotid has 3 branches. The ophthalmic branches are represented by his eyebrows, and the anterior cerebral is up here. And by the way, his little antennae, they're just continuations of the anterior cerebrals. The middle cerebral is this part of his eyes. Now recall that the posterior communicating joins the posterior cerebral to the anterior cerebral, while the anterior communicating connects the left and right anterior cerebrals together. And the posterior cerebrals, the posterior communicating, the anterior cerebrals, and the little anterior communicating artery form the alien's head, which represents the circle of Willis. Now, Willis's upper arms are the superior cerebellar arteries, his lower arms are the inferior cerebellar arteries, and his ribs right here are the pontines. So let me introduce to you Willis. Now it is my contention that if you remember my little alien creature Willis, then you cannot forget the arterial blood supply to your brain. And once again, I've put together this little infographic for you. I've included it as a PDF download, and you'll find it, of course, in the resources section for this lecture. Okay, so in the next lecture, we will locate and identify the major veins of the head and neck. So I hope to see you again shortly for that.